I'm Ken Jackson. I'm the president of the New York Historical Society, and I want to welcome you all to 77th Street and Central Park West. Instead of the regular program tonight, I've decided to read a lecture. Take about 3 hours, if you don't mind. Now, let me just say three things. First, this program, the first of several, focuses, of course, on New York in the 1960s when the World Trade Center was being born. And I think to think in a larger context, when we think of New York City in the 20th century, it's really important to remember that this metropolitan region has reinvented itself over the last half century. I often say that 50 years ago, New York was the most important industrial city in the world. Not Pittsburgh, not Chicago, not not Los Angeles, and of course not anywhere in Germany and Japan, which had been blown to smithereens, but New York. Not great aircraft or factories or steel mills or automobile plants like in Detroit, but thousands of little firms. People sewing on buttons, people making razor blades, people rolling cigars, people printing books and pamphlets, people making things. Allie, you don't want that? People giving long speeches. In the last half century, those jobs have all left. Not all of them, but there were more than 1 million, and now it's down to less than 150,000, or roughly that. An irreducible minimum. In some ways, New York City has shown the way for the rest of the country and the world. It went through, so companies went to the suburbs, first Singer sewing machine to Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1868, and it's been continuing then to the south and now to Indonesia or wherever. 50 years ago, New York City was also the most important port and harbor in the world, and had been for decades. In the last half century, the number of jobs has declined precipitously, partly because of the rise of the Pacific Rim and so many goods being imported from Asia, more because of the introduction of containerization, so that instead of hundreds of guys unloading bags and boxes, you have just a few people unloading what's really the back end of a tractor trailer truck. And it's sealed in Indonesia and they lift it off on a crane. What's important about New York City and the area is that it reinvented itself. It moved more toward a service, an information, a media economy. And the World Trade Center is at the center of that. So that in the 1960s, when it was being planned, in a way it was leading the way toward a new kind of city. A city that was organized around legal services and financial services and trading and media. And so when we think about the World Trade Center and the building of that giant complex, it's important to think of the large context. Secondly, I just wanted to remind you about what's obvious. That the World Trade Center, as it stood, was one of the most famous buildings in the world. It was, of course, with 10 million square feet, give or take, one of the largest office complexes ever conceived by man, at 110 stories, one of the biggest, a structure that dominated the skyline. But however it was important for those reasons, the attack of September 11 has raised it in historical consciousness to somewhere beyond where it was even when it existed. You probably could not find someone almost anywhere in the world who now does not know of the World Trade Center, who's not familiar with its image. So that every single thing about the World Trade Center has now assumed an importance beyond what it would have had, I think, absent that horrible attack. And so I think that's a special reason for us to focus on the issue. And the third thing I wanted to mention is the Skyscraper Museum in Carol Willis. Carol, who actually was, I think, initially my student more years ago than I like to remember, but who has since matured and grown into perhaps the leading scholar in the world on the history of the skyscraper, and someone who went beyond scholarship and writing to create an institution, and is someone who has walked in recent months to a standalone institution that already existed, and I feel like it's breaking my back. I cannot imagine the work that's involved in creating from scratch a new institution, and I don't know anyone other than Carol Willis who'd have done it. She's worked on Hugh Ferris. She's worked on the history of city planning and visions of city planning in the 1920s and 30s. She's written an immensely influential book called Form Follows Finance, which talks about the way we should look at skyscrapers not just as works of art, but as emblems of business, as structures that had to make economic sense and how they made economic sense. Anyway, Carol Willis, who's organized this session, who is the founder and creator of the exhibit on the monument, who has created out of scratch the Skyscraper Museum, and who's responsible for this program, which, as you know, was supposed to take place at the World Trade Center last fall and now has been moved to the New York Historical Society. So we want to say how much we respect and honor the Skyscraper Museum and wish it good fortune, and how pleased we are that Carol Willis has done such a wonderful job of curating that exhibition, which we expect to receive all the accolades it deserves. So without further ado, thank you for coming, and Carol, if you'd please come up. And here's a list of our programs, and here's a little membership brochure, so no one's allowed to leave until they've signed up. We try to do it the easy way, but if you want to be unpleasant and resist, we can do it that way as well. So.
Thank you, Ken, for such a wonderful introduction, and especially for the historical introduction rather than one for me, because he has a higher opinion of me than I do of myself. But we agree on the history and the context for the World Trade Center. I'm going to do a quick overview of some slides of images that are in the exhibition or not, simply to set the stage, because I'm not the main event for tonight. Guy Tazzoli and Don Elliott are to talk about their experiences in replanning and revisioning Lower Manhattan in the 1960s, and in making and overseeing constructing the World Trade Center. This is the first of 4 series, and I want to mention especially with this particular slide up, which was taken by Les Robertson, who's the structural engineer for the World Trade Center, is sitting over there and is our featured speaker for next week. Not next week, but next time, along with John Tishman, who was the general contractor for Tishman Construction for the World Trade Center. Tonight, somewhere out there, because the lights are shining so bright on me I can't see, but Carl Koch, who heads his family's firm, who erected the steel at the World Trade Center, is also here, and I hope he'll have something to say at our next time as well. The idea of this series was really to bring together the people who designed and planned and constructed and operated. Bob DiChiara is here tonight too. He helped to operate the World Trade Center over these the 30 years that it was the largest office complex in the world. We thought back last spring that when the Skyscraper Museum, on the verge of having its permanent home in Battery Park City, which we hope will be open, and we know will be open by the end of this year, that in building our collection, we should begin with the obvious buildings. And first we started with the Empire State Building, and then we moved to the World Trade Center. And so we conceived this program series back last spring in a collection that would bring together in a comprehensive and systematic way the people who are still around and still working professionals, as you'll meet tonight, who were responsible for these tremendous projects. And the thing I just want to take note of is how young they all were when they were doing this, in their 30s, mid and early 30s, when they took on the responsibility to build the world's largest and tallest office buildings. So that's something to take note, that in that span of time with the buildings and the people who are no longer here, that the ones who are here need to be listened to, and I'm so glad that there are so many of you here tonight to listen to their stories. And I'm going to show you, oh, that's reverse. going to show you very quickly a series of slides. That last one, I meant to mention the end of that sentence about Les Robertson, is that he took that photograph. I think it's probably the single best photograph that's ever been taken of the World Trade Center, where you can see right through the buildings, finished but not yet completely occupied. So you get that skeleton view of the images at dawn from a helicopter view looking out over east towards the rising sun. And we had looked at the World Trade Center as the world's tallest buildings and as icons of New York in previous exhibitions. And I remember when Bob DiChiara arranged for me to get that model of the World Trade Center into our first exhibition at 44 Wall Street, where when we were looking at the world's tallest towers, it went back to the Twin Towers. It came back out again for another exhibition, then went back again. And there were two of these, and they were both destroyed when the towers fell. Which is one of the reasons why we want to do a collection. So we hope we'll preserve them in perpetuity. We looked at the world's tallest buildings, and we also looked at the world's largest buildings. And the World Trade Center qualified in both categories. In an exhibition called Big Buildings, we used this wonderful map by Urban Data Solutions to color code the biggest buildings in New York and in the world in their successive cycles of building. And I won't go through the long explanation to tell you what jumbos are and super jumbos, but anything that's colored here is twice as big as an average big building of its period, of its building cycle. And if we go to 1950 to the present, the buildings that are in red are 2 million square feet or more. And in the whole world, there are only about currently 35 buildings that have 2 million square feet or more. About half of them are in New York. Most of those were downtown. And then if you go twice as big as that, twice as big as a jumbo, you have a super jumbo, and that's each one of the World Trade Center towers. Each building, an acre of floor plate multiplied 110 stories into the air, for about 4 million square feet of rentable space, twice as big as every one of those red buildings. Phenomenally big. And it's that I want to go through very quickly in the series of slides, many of which are in the exhibition. Buildings that represented the culmination of the evolution of size, not just height, but of size in skyscraper history in the 20th century. We've never built buildings larger since. In the last 30 years, we've built them as tall. Arguably, the Petronas Towers in Kuala Lumpur have the title of the world's tallest towers, but each one of those twin towers has only 2.3 million square feet in it. So they're about half the size. Together, they make pretty much only a little bit bigger than one World Trade Center tower. And it's so obvious when you look and you bring back the photographs and you look at the city that was being born in the 1960s and 70s, this monumental scale that supplants all of the history that goes before. And you only need to look back to the historic core of any of the teens or 20 towers of the Wall Street district, and to see how overlorded they are by the gigantism of the Trade Center. It was so big it had a kind of scalelessness. As you see it there, as it was in real life, it looks much like the model that envisioned the future Twin Towers in promotional brochures that were put out by the Port Authority back from about 1968 or so as the building is underway. You see it there in one version of Yamasaki's model. Unfortunately, we have the only surviving architectural model of the Trade Center, Yamasaki's model, in the exhibition with its 7-foot tall towers, somewhat damaged, but will be restored after the exhibition is over. It'll go into conservation. And the buildings themselves had the same sort of abstract scalelessness of the towers, but they were so big. That's very clear in construction photos, and I'll show you only a few looking straight up the face of that exterior bearing wall structure that was so innovative and brilliantly engineered. And many of these photographs you'll see in the exhibition, along with the kind of promotional brochures that marketed the Trade Center to a population of a whole new set of businesses, or an old set of businesses that were trying to be retained. And Guy Tuzzoli is going to tell us something of that tonight. I just want to show you a few more views of the site, because it's really the context for the Trade Center in the 1960s that frames this evening and that I think is so interesting to look back upon as it relates to the problem of Lower Manhattan that we confront today. At least in that one area, a kind of blank slate into which we will pour all of our grief, our ambition, our creativity, I hope, our money, all of those things, and of our sense of urban life. If we go back to why the building sits on the site it does, and Guy Tozzoli is going to talk about that a little bit tonight. There are historical reasons that we try to retrieve a little bit in the exhibition. First planned for an East River site, the World Trade Center moved over to the west side, largely because of a political compromise that was made with New Jersey and the Port of New York and the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a bi-state agency, were of course the clients and developers for the Trade Center towers. But to save what became the PATH trains, the Hudson and Manhattan Railway, from bankruptcy, the Trade Center moved to the west side site. It knocked down these twin towers, which were the world's largest office buildings of their day when they were completed in 1907-8. And in a series of really extraordinary photographs from the Thomas's Air views that are in the exhibition but are in 100-fold number in the files and the archives of the New York Historical Society, we can see the site, we can see the building, we can see the site and we can see the buildings emerging. And what we see what I saw when I went back and I looked through this extraordinary collection of Thomas's Air views is hundreds of shots of a city that I didn't recognize anymore. I came to New York in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, and I didn't know downtown. A lot of people still don't know downtown, but I certainly didn't know it as a working waterfront or as the obsolete waterfront that it was in the late 1960s. And what these photographs make clear is how the city was imprisoned in the 60s by a kind of industrial corset of steel, of these finger piers that separated the rest of the city from the water and were not being used for anything. Well, you see a few ships, but the drafts of big ships that are profitable were already too deep to unload their cargo at this port. And as Ken mentioned, the containerization had already started in the Port Authority project with the Port Newark. There were changes that were inevitable in Lower Manhattan, and the city hadn't yet caught up with that, with that reality. And that seemed to me so clear from the photographs. I'm sorry this one is so dark, but these are the two enlarged photographs in the exhibition that show you New York in 1956 here, with its piers all still in place, with its historic core as yet uninterrupted by any modern building. And 20 years later, the complete renaissance or revival, the physical enlargement of Lower Manhattan with the landfill that was Battery Park City that Guy Tozzoli is going to tell us about that idea and how it was born, with the Water Street corridor over on the East River side that added about as much million square feet as the World Trade Center did on the west side. So Lower Manhattan was reinvented, and it was reinvented by planning and by public policy. And that's why Don Elliott is here tonight as well. I'm showing you just a few views of the envisioning of the future of Lower Manhattan that was published in the Lower Manhattan Plan of 1966, that then became the document that went forward in a whole series of brilliant plans issued by the City Planning Commission and a number of other planning agencies, including the Port Authority, for reinventing Lower Manhattan. And you see it in the current scale in 1966 and in the scale that they were already envisioning and building with the World Trade Center. I'm happy to say that the Lower Manhattan Plan, which was only ever published in 100 copies, we're going to reprint, the Skyscraper Museum is going to reprint by next fall with Princeton Architectural Press. So, and I hope it'll be an affordable student version. So this will be brought back into public use, and I hope it will be a useful and inspirational document for people who are looking at replanning Lower Manhattan. These are too dark for you to see, but what they show you is sort of the level of intense data collecting and creative planning that was, and analysis that was brought to the idea of reinventing the waterfront and creating two new commercial cores. And then the single best idea, and the one that has fortunately been realized over the years, at least in part, for reinventing Lower Manhattan was opening the waterfront up to people again, and to recreation and to residents. And that was advanced in some of the graphics that you see of the plan of 1966. The contrast of what was and the process of building the new city in some of these wonderful views, and of the tragic lost view, but the new commercial center of the World Financial Center, and of course the complex of high-rises and mid-rises that are Battery Park City, the new residential neighborhood. And in this building, right here, the new home for the Skyscraper Museum, in a view that is right outside our door, the way that it used to look, and I hope we'll have will be a lasting image in the new home when we open at the end of this year. So that's the slides and quick overview. And why don't I ask Guy and Don to come up to the stage, and I will sort of introduce them as make sure that our microphones work there. You have your name. Yes, that one. Okay. I think you're over there. This is me. This is you. Yeah. I've given Guy Tazzoli a crib sheet of questions, but I have no doubt that he's going to go on automatic pilot on a lot of these issues and entertain us with really incredible stories. And I want to very briefly introduce these impressive men. And I want them to have time to talk. I've taken too much already. But Guy Tazzoli was with the Port Authority for a good 50 years. I guess I don't have to tell you that he was born in North Bergen, New Jersey, and all of that, and trained as an engineer, which is important for the Port Authority because engineers who build big things, build towers, and undertake to do things like the World Trade Center. He worked for the Port Authority back in the 50s, but then in February '62 he was appointed director of the World Trade Department, which is the department that oversaw the construction of the World Trade Center. And he was responsible for the planning, construction, rental, and operation of the World Trade Center, a project which is overall 15 million square feet, tallest building in the world at the time, largest office complex in the world. And I don't think I need to say too much more than that, but I will tell you that since 1970, he's been a leader in founding, and his current position is the president of the World Trade Centers Association, which is a worldwide organization promoting trade. And he has had the honor that very few of us have had, to have been nominated as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize. So with that introduction of both local and international interest, I guess I'll ask Guy Tazzoli to speak first, and then I'll introduce Don Elliott.
Thank you very much.
I think, do you want to put the ask them, can we get the lights down or out?
Can we put the lights on? I like to
Oh,
see
on. He wants to see, on. You want to see the people? Okay.
I love to see people. Be better, because if I have those lights in my eyes, it's not as good. I like to look down. Maybe, huh?
Don't work on it. Good.
Oh, I see. Okay. Fine. That'll be all right. Ladies and gentlemen, Carol, Don, it's a great pleasure for me to be here tonight. And I hope that in the short time that we have, I will be able to cover the highlights, if you would, of what took place starting in the year 1960, taking us through the unfortunate incident of 9/11, and then we'll back ourselves up a little bit to talk about what is it that the World Trade Centers Association can do for people. Many of you, I am sure, were not aware that there is an association of World Trade Centers, which I started in 1970, with 16 people in a room from 16 cities and 7 countries, to create reciprocity between trade centers, to have information shared between people. And all of that on a very simple principle of what I believe deeply in. I call it peace and stability through trade. If I understand your culture and I respect your culture, there is very little likelihood that we will war upon one another. And so that was the principle that started what is now the largest trading association in the world, 306 World Trade Center members, 91 countries, servicing more than 750,000 international companies. I'm probably, if you think about it, the most fortunate man in the whole world. Think of the opportunity that was given to me by the Port Authority, more specifically a great man, Austin Tobin, in the year 1962. If you were given the opportunity to plan, design, construct, operate a project which was the cornerstone for the redevelopment of an area of Lower Manhattan that was dying, I would say that very few people in the world have such an opportunity. The Reader's Digest called it the largest building project since the pyramids. There are other reasons why I'm the most fortunate in the world. In 1993, on a very cold Friday, February 26th, I live in New Jersey. I'm an hour and 10 minutes from the World Trade Center garage, my home in Westwood. On that particular day, I called my office at 11 a.m. and I said, my calendar says I have a meeting at 12:30 with people from Bucharest, Romania, who are interested in the World Trade Center. My secretary said, no, it's 12 o'clock. Oh, I said, it'll take me 10 minutes to get ready. And I should be in the garage between 12:15 and 12:20. I went to the George Washington Bridge and down the New York side of the river. And that day I traveled faster. And on that day I drove into the garage, not at 12:15 or 12:20, but at 12:10. Went up to my office quickly. The bomb blew in the garage at 12:18. The only people that were killed were in the garage. 6,000 people were hurt. On September 11, in the same house, I decided the night before, where I had been meeting with people from the World Trade Centers Association at Windows on the World, I decided that I wanted to get to work early. And I left my house at 7 a.m. I presume that would get me into the garage maybe at 8:15 or 8:20. And for some inexplicable reason, 10 minutes after I left, I decided I should not go to the George Washington Bridge. Why, I don't know. I decided that I should stay on the New Jersey side of the river, and I would head to the Holland Tunnel, which, as all of you know, is right opposite the World Trade Center. And I, unfortunately for me, I'm sure, at the entrance to the Lincoln Tunnel, a terrible bus accident occurred, and it backed up the Jersey Turnpike where I was on my way to the Holland Tunnel. And for 45 minutes, with no radio on, I sat in the car, unable to move. And when I got to the Holland Tunnel Plaza, I looked up and I saw the hole in Tower Number 1. My first thought was a helicopter, not possible, too big. Second thought was, why is it that pilots who are trained to go into the river if they're in trouble in the landing area, why would they hit the towers? And then it began to dawn on me that maybe, this was a deliberate act. And I was out of the car because we were stopped in the plaza, and I saw plane number 2 heading for Tower Number 2. At a speed, I am sure, because I've seen so many planes out my window, and my office is on the 77th floor of Tower Number 1. And I saw it smash into Tower 2. This great ball of fire, and my first thought, those poor people above, they have no chance to get out. And then I'll be honest, I cried. I had spent most of my life creating the World Trade Center. To me, it was my life, really. Then I became very angry. And then I resolved that minute that the irony of heading an association devoted to peace and stability through trade should be destroyed by people who were criminals. And the rest of my life, for whatever time I had left, would be devoted to the World Trade Centers Association. And if in any way I can contribute to the recreation of the World Trade Center of New York, which I think New York needs very badly, there is virtually no major city in the world that does not have a World Trade Center. Now we'll back ourselves up to 1960. In 1960, Lower Manhattan was dying. People were moving out of Lower Manhattan either to Mid-Manhattan or out of the city. No new buildings, office buildings, had been built in Lower Manhattan since World War II, with the exception of the Chase Manhattan Bank. And David Rockefeller headed and started an association called the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association to redevelop that area. His brother, Nelson, was the governor of the state of New York, and as many of you know, the Port Authority reports to the two governors, New York and New Jersey, with its dual responsibility, coordination of transportation facilities, and also promotion and protection of the Port of New York. David asked his brother, Nelson, to ask the Port Authority if it would study the feasibility of constructing in Lower Manhattan an economic development entity that would be the anchor, the cornerstone, the beginnings of a redevelopment of Lower Manhattan, to attract people to Lower Manhattan, to create jobs in Lower Manhattan, to bring housing to Lower Manhattan. But David didn't want to study, David wanted a project. The original location that the DLMA had chosen in its preliminary studies, as Carol told you, was on the east side of Lower Manhattan. And this is a very interesting thing. The team, made up of Port Authority people, was assigned 3 architects, all great architects in their own right: Skidmore, Owens and Merrill, Wally Harrison, and Edward Durrell Stone. And something else that people do not realize now, one of the initial buildings included was a commerce exchange, which was really a new home for the stock exchange. They needed to anchor it in Lower Manhattan and keep the financial and shipping people who were there already with services that they would need to carry out their business. Then people began to study the possibility and no towers yet, just a plan with some preliminary buildings on the east side. And Carroll said that for reasons of politics, the state of New Jersey wanted the Port Authority to take over the Hudson and Manhattan tubes, which are now PATH, Port Authority Trans-Hudson. And that was true. But the melding of the two projects was a magnificent reality for one reason. In all of New York City, there is no transportation center greater than the area where the World Trade Center was placed. There are 3 subways that run right through the site, a new PATH, Old Hudson to Manhattan, a new station. And what it did is it put the parameters of how we would plan this great project. We had to plan it with the studies that told us how many square feet of space we needed. We needed to plan it for 100,000 people working there, for 100,000 business visitors, approximately, and 50,000 commuters who passed through PATH and made their way to either the stock exchange or to the other places that sprang up. So the World Trade Center of New York was given the job to put together this project. One of the first things that I did in February, believe it or not, it was this month. This is the 40th anniversary of the creation of the World Trade Department. I had had a fascinating job before that. I worked on containers. But in 1960, the Port Authority loaned me to a great man, Mr. Robert Moses, and I was his vice president for the transportation exhibit section of the World's Fair. And some of you have been there. Some of you are too young to have been there in 1964 and 65. That was a great time for me from 60 to 62 to work with Walt Disney and the people there. And I began to learn things that could be used in the World Trade Center. In 1962, the Port Authority and Austin Tobin decided that I should head this group. One of the first things that I realized was it just was not possible to come to a design that would be unified and would create the great World Trade Center that everybody wanted. They wanted an economic development entity. And what does a World Trade Center do? It's a very simple idea. It helps people do international business and servicing international business more efficiently. And so we decided that what we needed to do was to find one architect who would have the skills, the imagination, the spirit that we wanted to embody in the World Trade Center of New York. We wanted to make it the greatest project in the entire world. His beliefs in the cooperation of men, and through cooperation, his ability to find greatness. That was one of the reasons that we picked Mr. Yamasaki. But we also knew that this was a project that needed to support itself and carry out the exact legislation that made it a public project, passed in identical legislation in 2 states of New York and New Jersey. And so, Mr. Yamasaki had an office just outside of Detroit. And another interesting story. I had 2 deputies. One was Dick Sullivan, very, very smart young man. Another was Mal Levy, a genius in design, a great engineer. And I called him into the office. I said, listen, Mr. Yamasaki is a great architect. He'll be the principal architect. What I would like you to do is go to Emery Roth's office, who had never heard from us and was never interviewed, because they are perfect to complement Mr. Yamasaki's grand designs. They are working for all of the developers who are building in New York, and it was a period of great, great development through the entire city. And I'll make the story short. The people for Emery Roth were stupefied that two men should walk in off the street and say, would you like to design the biggest project in the world? And then in finding out by calling a friend of my father's, believe it or not, it was a little contractor in New York, in New Jersey, and he had a friend for whom he built a house, and one of the Roth brothers knew him and said, listen, do you know Tizzoli and Levy and Sullivan? And Emery Roth told me later that they came to the conclusion that first night, since somebody walks off the street, the Port Authority must be the smartest organization in the world. It put the development of this project in the hands of an Italian, a Jew, and an Irishman. In any case, Mr. Yamasaki worked in models. He had about 50 different schemes. We had 16 acres. Carol showed you the site. Within that area, we had to develop what had been studied. Now, one thing that I was told right away, and he's not here to contradict this, so I can tell him. About a month after I started my job, I was ordered to go down and talk to Mayor Wagner. And Mr. Wagner said, Guy, there will be no stock exchange in your World Trade Center. It must remain in Wall Street. Therefore, that was out. And then the second thing happened. And this is a myth that people talked about for quite some time. Mr. Rockefeller decided that the state should put 2 million feet into our 12 million feet of office space. And people thought that the state was actually supporting the World Trade Center. Nothing could be further from the truth. They paid me $5 a square foot for about 20 years. So really, that's what it was. It's just that we had to plan for them to be in the project. And Mr. Yamasaki liked the Twin Towers, a plaza. The requirements were 1 million square feet for a customs house, a hotel of 820 rooms, a place for the commodity trading people, another mart building. I had to build a substation for Con Ed, which is underneath 7 World Trade Center. That's the building that Mr. Silverstein built on top of the substation, 2 million square feet. And when I liked the plan, and so did everybody else, I said to Mr. Yamasaki, I said, Yama, does this meet my program? No, he said, Guy, it's 2 million feet short. I said, why is that? He said, you can't build a building more than 80 floors high. And I remember the year specifically. I said, Yama, as I used to call him, President Kennedy is going to put a man on the moon. And when I was given the job, the first thing I did is I went back to all of the studies that had been made from 60 to 61 through 62. And buried in that was a memorandum written to the study group. It came from the Public Relations Department of the Port Authority, and Sid Fregan, who's been a great man in that group, is sitting out there. And the woman's name was Lee Jaffe. And she had written to the study group and said, if you were to build the greatest project in the world, you should build the tallest building in the world. And that's exactly how that thought entered. And it had been dismissed. But now Mr. Yamasaki was 2 million feet short, and we were restricted by the 16 acres of ground. We could not enlarge it beyond that, and he liked the Twin Tower scheme. So people went to work. I had a group of architects and engineers who were a small group because we did it all with outside people. And Mr. Yamasaki was trying to figure out, I said, what's the problem? The problem is elevators take too much space. And a young man came into my office. His name was Herb Tesla. He worked for me. He was an architect. He said, you know, Guy, I have an idea. I said, what's that? He said, why don't we build an elevatoring system like the subways work? I said, tell me what that means. He said, if I want to go from 125th Street to 50th Street, what I do is I take the express elevator from 125th to 59, I cross the platform, and I take one stop on a local. He said, suppose we built a building in which we put all the local elevators in the center, and we build the largest elevators in the world to carry people, which would go to the third points of the building. Now, if we take 110 floors, we'll use big elevators with first one in, first one out, to floor 44 on the left side, locals in the middle. On the right-hand side, we go up to 78, second sky lobby, we invented a name. And we put the locals for the second zone there, and then the top zone, locals in the middle. And we then produce, by that, for the first time, the most efficient building in the world of usable to gross. Very important. In the Port Authority, a director, if he didn't pay back the money that he was given to build this project, would be fired, and that wasn't a good idea for me. I needed to have affordable space. And this worked. We put it on a computer, and it said, these buildings are over-elevated. And then an interesting aside, Mr. Tobin, when he gave me the job, said, you know, Guy, you've never built a high-rise building. But he said, I'm going to give you 7 people who are advisors from the real estate and banking field. And I went to them and said, here is an idea that has been thought of by one of my architects. It's been looked at in the computer. And they voted 7-0 that it was a bad idea, that no one would ever rent space in the top 2 zones because you had to transfer. And this is something you couldn't take back. But I was able to convince Austin Tobin and some of the people from the computer work that was there that people would soon get used to the first one in, first one out. And that was one of the most successful things that the Trade Center had, the towers, the great towers. And so that solved that problem. Now, Don Elliott, who was a good friend, and I'm happy to see him here. I haven't seen him in a while. You know, he worked for John Lindsay, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his side of the story. The Port Authority was in the process of negotiating with the City of New York, and we started with the Wagner administration. And then John Lindsay came into office. And we were very close to a decision, I thought, to complete our agreement. And I thought if I could think of one more thing that might help to close the deal. And I was shaving one morning, and I said, I know what I'll do. I'll take the dirt out of the bottom of the Trade Center, because we're going to build this big bathtub, and instead of sending it out to sea, I'll just put it in a river. And I'll give it to the City of New York. And that was the start of Battery Park City. John Lindsay's first words were, Guy, you're going to save money. No, I said, you have to take it out to sea, but I have to put a wall around it. So therefore, that's how Battery Park City started. That's how the World Financial Center started. And that led, I remember John's second question. Lindsay said, how many acres? I said, I haven't the slightest idea. Rock is down here someplace. As it turned out, it was the first 23.5 acres of the 100 acres that make up the area of housing and offices and the great project that is on the river, space for people to walk. It's a lovely place to be. And so that's how that took place. Also, Carol asked if I'd address some of the problems that we had. Well, we had plenty of problems, but when we took the site, we did it by condemnation. There was an area called Radio Row of small people who sold electronics. But unfortunately, at 3 o'clock, everybody left. The stock market closed. And the Port Authority had the ability to relocate, and we relocated people. Some did not relocate. But that caused a problem for people. Some people lost their livelihood. And I guess things like that have to happen, if you would. It was a small number of people. Initially, the site of the World Trade Center was the Washington Market in 1873. I was telling Carol tonight, we dug up a time capsule, and the time capsule came from 1873 in the Washington Market, and in the capsule was some Between the Axe cigars, and there were 17 cards from a place called the Irish Foundry Works, and the barrister said, "We are here in 1873, we'll put our cards in this capsule. We don't know what to say, but we do hope that the people who dig this up will be building a greater marketplace." And then, most interesting to me, there were two newspapers. One, Variety, and the second, on the front page, had three very interesting articles. The first article said that crime in the streets in New York was horrible. If you went past Wall Street, it was worth your life. The second said that what we have here is inflation beyond any recognition you can have. The cost of a meal has gone beyond a penny. And the third struck a guy by the name of Tizzoli in the heart, because it said those terrible Italians are coming in and taking our jobs for less money than we pay other people. And that was on the front page of the newspaper of 1873. But it made me feel good, because we dug up a whole series of things at that site. You know, the Tiger, the first Dutch trading ship that used to ply the colonies, was burned at its site, and we dug up a little piece of it, if you would, and a cannon and cannonballs and all kinds of things, because the World Trade Center, believe it or not, was landfill that had been created a century before. So that was we were just making Manhattan a little bigger. Let me talk just a little more about the World Trade Centers Association. What David Rockefeller wanted was an economic development entity that would help people trade more efficiently. The Trade Center accomplished both of those missions. In Lower Manhattan, since the announcement of the World Trade Center, over 97 million square feet of office space was constructed, larger than any other city in the world with the exception of Mid-Manhattan and China, and Chicago. Interesting. That was number one. Number two, the World Trade Center was designed to help people trade more efficiently because it creates jobs, both in international business and servicing international business. When we studied the World Trade Center concept in the year 1962, international trade accounted for 2.7% of our gross national product. Today, international trade accounts for more than 22% of our gross national product. So therefore, the administration, the information, the education, the things that are done to help people trade more efficiently are as important to us, but they're more important to people in other parts of the world. So as our service economy grew, some of our manufacturing jobs left. But I can't tell you how my heart goes out to the people who lost their jobs because of the service of the people that had to leave and could no longer be part of the World Trade Center of New York. I started the association in 1970 with 16 people in a room. Korea and Taiwan became members in 1971. 1974, the USSR became a member of the World Trade Centers Association in the height of the Cold War, and I went, honestly, on the FBI's most wanted list. They used to follow me. Open all my packages. It was the Cold War. But I had a non-political organization and a deep feeling that if people would trade together and respect one another, that they wouldn't make war. In 1978, the Minister of Trade of the People's Republic of China invited me to Beijing. I spent 3 days there. He said China will join the World Trade Centers Association, and I was happy about that, and then found that their condition on that was I would expel Taiwan. So for 3 years, the Chinese and I negotiated, and finally we had a very simple solution. I changed trade centers to be cities instead of countries. And so we have 16 trade centers in China, we have 3 in Taiwan, and the WTCA is now one of the largest trading associations in the world. I think my time is about running out here, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you. Maybe we'll have time for questions later, or I'll be around if anybody wants to ask me anything. But there was a sign on my desk, and I would be remiss if I didn't tell you what that sign said. It was on my desk in the Trade Center since I began the project, and it stayed there, and now it's in the bottom of that rubble. The sign said there are 6 phases to a project. The first phase is enthusiasm. The second phase is doubt. The third phase of a great project is panic. The fourth phase of a project is search for the guilty. The fifth phase of a project is punishment of the innocent. And the sixth phase of the project is credit for those who didn't have a damn thing to do with the project. Thank you.
I'll introduce you from here, you go over there. A very brief introduction for Don Elliott, who was the chairman of the City Planning Commission under Mayor Lindsay from 1967 to 73, and is now currently working as a lawyer for Hollier, Brady, Smith, and Hines. When I asked him what are the things he's most proud of, he mentioned his helping to originate the Trust for Cultural Resources, which is another one of his sort of admirable and do-good efforts. I mention that because although I don't know Don, I mentioned this evening to a number of people that I do know well, and every one of them said, Don Elliott, he's the nicest man I know. And boy, I can't think of a better introduction than that. So.
Well, Carol, I thank you for those very kind words, although I may contradict them right at the beginning. I'm in a very strange situation here because the Trade Center has taken on a life quite different than any other building that any of us know anything about. And it is many of the things that have been said for it. Certainly we're all in favor of world trade and we're in favor of peace. But I was not in a situation where I was a great booster of this project or one who encouraged its completion. So I think I meet Guy's last thing, that people take credit for something they had absolutely nothing to do with. I was even worse than that. When John Lindsay came into office, the legislation had already been passed, which gave the site to the Port Authority. As you have heard, a lot of work had gone forward. We're talking now about the early 1966 on a project that had been underway since 1962, that Nelson Rockefeller was very enthusiastic about. We were very skeptical as to whether a publicly financed office building in Lower Manhattan was a good idea, as to whether it would in fact encourage world trade, and whether there were not better ways to do it. I must confess we never lost our skepticism about just the sheerest coincidence that it was going to be the tallest building in the world and therefore taller than the Empire State Building. Guy, I think, has told us that's not so. It was designed to be the tallest building in the world. And that was pretty clear when I remember Yamasaki in my early days in the commission, I was invited over to be given, when the Port Authority put on a presentation, they were first rate. There's just no question about that. And I was in a position where I was entitled, I guess, to a fairly good presentation, the architect himself explaining it. And it was an exciting afternoon, if not totally convincing. Anyway, the construction of the Trade Center was something which was clear we weren't going to be able to stop. But there was one small error made by the Rockefeller administration when they passed the legislation. They neglected to pick up a piece of one street, as I recall it. And we had theoretically a way to stop the construction of the center because we didn't have to allow the street to be closed. It was obvious to us that that was preposterous. This was a project with enormous energy behind it, and all they had to do was go back to the legislature and solve the problem. But we could have been troublesome for a little while. So I was designated to negotiate this issue with Austin Tobin. Some of you in this room may get some sense. Austin Tobin was, in some areas, the most powerful development authority man in the world, and a guy of enormous integrity and stature. He'd taken on the Congress and the various legislatures without blinking an eye. At any rate, he offered that the Port Authority would build the Superliner terminal in Midtown, a project that we were enthusiastic about. And to make a long story short, that was what we agreed to do. I then naively said, well, we ought to have a memorandum of understanding. We ought to put this in writing. And Mr. Tobin said, no, sir, that isn't the way it's going to be. I'm not going to do anything in writing. I'm giving you my word that we will do that, but there's not going to be, this is not a deal. And we thought about that and decided that was the best we were going to get and agreed to it. Interestingly enough, at 2 or 3 times thereafter, the things that the city had agreed to do, we didn't do promptly, and we didn't do effectively. And Mr. Tobin would have had a perfectly good argument that we had not carried out our side of the deal, and he therefore didn't have to build the Superliner terminal. But he did not avail himself of those, and he in fact built the Superliner terminal. And I've always thought that was an indication of the nature of the man that he was. He and Guy also went forward and built the Trade Center, as you have seen and heard. But this was a period in Lower Manhattan when we were all enthusiastic about the possibility of reinventing Lower Manhattan and rebuilding it. We came at it from a different point of view than the Port Authority, but fortunately, our points of views merged, and I think the net result of it was really quite spectacular success. The real fact is that the critical event in Lower Manhattan was David Rockefeller deciding to build the Chase Manhattan Bank building, a 60-story building at a time when no one was building certainly a major corporate office building in Lower Manhattan. And he led the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, which you've heard referred to before, for a very substantial period of time, trying to figure out how to make Lower Manhattan work. And those of you who are interested should take a hard look at the model, which is sitting out as a part of this exhibit, which was created by DLMA to show the projects that they wanted to see done. It has the Trade Center. It has the predecessor to Battery Park City, which was Nelson Rockefeller's view of how the residential development along the landfill should be carried out. And it has the Lower Manhattan Expressway. And it was a vision of the city, which again, we did not agree with in total. We didn't agree with the design of Battery Park City at all. We didn't want the cross Manhattan Expressway under any circumstances. But we saw in the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association an extremely important, very powerful group of business leaders. The major banks and businesses in Lower Manhattan were members of DLMA, and no one went except the chief executive. If the chief executive was not available, they were not represented at the table. And the meetings were periodic and well scheduled and very well attended. And so we had, as the city, a very important partner who we decided early on we were going to work with. And we created an Office of Lower Manhattan Development in which we had some very able people, including Richard Weinstein. And together, we tried to develop a community that would, in effect, be a new, vibrant, functioning city that would have residences of many income levels, that would provide opportunities for walk to work and for jobs, that would have ameliorating and entertaining activities, the South Street Seaport being, in one of the cases, one of the most important, but also museums and activity along the waterfront. And the idea was to transform an area which had been largely industrial, but after all, the financial capital of the world, Wall Street, up until 1929, back into a serious part of New York City. And what I'd like to do is just tell you a few of the things. Our technique in planning was not just to publish a plan and say that's what it is. We did, in fact, adopt the 1966 plan, which Carol has. We then created a 1969 plan. I brought this along because if anybody disagrees with what I said, I have a book. I wrote a book on the subject, which I'd be glad to have you. If it's written, it must be true. And what we were trying to do was to take advantage of opportunities as they presented themselves. And I'd like to just give you a few examples. The South Street Seaport is one that was very dramatic. South Street Seaport Museum was a very small, struggling organization. Schermerhorn Row was a very interesting, historic set of buildings which had various had various commercial uses during its lifetime. When we got around to restoring it, there was a big fight among the historians as to which one of its various lives it would be restored to, since it had changed quite radically 2 or 3 times. But the major problem was, as development began to be possible again, the South Street Seaport was an extremely obvious place to put office buildings. And since the land was not valuable at the time, and the museum certainly wasn't valuable, you could tear down this stuff that was there and build an office building. We wanted to preserve it. So we did something which I don't think has ever been done before. We convinced the banks that held the mortgages to release the mortgages from the land and place the mortgages on the air rights, which we put in a bank, or what we called a bank, and which we said these air rights can be transferred to 7 sites which we had chosen. And when they were transferred, they will be sold, and when they were sold, the mortgages would be paid off. And we got, with some help from the Chase and Citibank, we got the mortgagees to be willing to do that, and we therefore saved the Seaport. It then became, the Rouse Company came in, and eventually, it is what it is today. Our view of Lower Manhattan was that there should be landfill from the Seaport south on the east side and from the Trade Center south on the west side, and that we should see office and residential construction. We wanted to see the stock exchange on the east side in an area we called Manhattan Landing. Battery Park City became the site on the west side. Battery Park City was a project of Nelson Rockefeller's, and Manhattan Landing was a project of John Lindsay's, and they were not entirely in agreement from time to time. And we had a a very serious negotiation with respect to Battery Park City. But fundamentally, we all wanted to see progress. The kind of refusal to compromise which has characterized this city for the last decade or so really didn't exist in those days. Pataki and Giuliani didn't get along any worse than John Lindsay and Nelson Rockefeller got along. But we found a way not to stop a project because the guys at the top in the political arena couldn't make up their mind. And we got an agreement out of the state that there would be a wide range of incomes built in Battery Park City and allowed that project to go forward through the Board of Estimate. Unfortunately, the range of incomes didn't manifest itself, but the project has been built, and really quite brilliantly, as you know. Another situation was 55 Water Street, which I guess was the first. The Trade Center is the largest office building in the world, but 55 Water Street was the largest privately owned building at the time. It was 3.2 million square feet. And they came to us and wanted to build this building. In order to make Manhattan Landing work, we had to get across the East Side Highway, and we convinced them to design this building with a park and a promenade that would go over the highway when Manhattan Landing was built, and that's why it's designed in what may seem to you somewhat strange manner as you get down there and look at it. But it's waiting, because in due course Manhattan Landing will be built and it will be used. We did the same thing with respect to the Second Avenue subway. Along Water Street during this period, we got 11 buildings were built. And Water Street is the end of the Second Avenue subway. And it was clear that when the subway got down there, we wanted to be able to connect the subway stations into the basements of the buildings. Well, if you build all the mechanical equipment of the building on the side where the subway is going to be, you can't get through it, and it gets too expensive. So we convinced the builders of the buildings where the subway station will be to put in knockout panels and not to put any of their heavy equipment where the entrance will come from the subway. Those are the kinds of things that you have to keep trying to think about and prepare for the future, you know, even if maybe over a long period of time it doesn't happen. One of the most interesting was the U.S. Steel building, which is now One Liberty Plaza. The developers of that building came to the commission and said, we want to close Liberty Street because we want to build a building bigger than would be allowed on the site on the north side of Liberty Street. Well, because of the Trade Center and because of the super blocks, we couldn't close Liberty Street. It was there were few enough streets going through, and we considered it critical. So we finally agreed with them that what we would do is to allow them to transfer the development rights from the south side of Liberty Street onto the north side in order to build the building of a size they wanted and we wanted. And we said, in return for that, you've got to turn the south side into a park. And that negotiation was going forward, and they said, well, we agree, we're quite willing to do it, but unfortunately, chock full of nuts in the ground floor of a 27-story office building, which we're going to tear down and turn into a park, has a lease that runs for 8 years after the completion of the U.S. Steel building was supposed to be completed, and we can't buy the lease. And we don't have the power to condemn it, and therefore we can't do what you're asking us to do. So we said, okay, you can go ahead and transfer the development rights, but you've got to promise us that at the end of the lease you will demolish the balance of the building and turn it into a park. Everybody confidently expected that when the 27-story building came down to 1 story, that the dust falling into the chock full of nuts would convince them that it really wasn't a good idea to stay there and that this would become a non-problem. It didn't. The 27-story building came down to 1 story. It sat there for 8 years. At the end of the 8 years, they lived up to their commitment and tore it down and completed the park. As you know, it's a staging ground at the moment for various kinds of construction equipment and so forth. And One Liberty Plaza is the renamed, it was Merrill Lynch's building for a while, and then it became One Liberty Plaza. We tried to do a whole series of things to make the density that was being created tolerable. We wanted to end up with a pedestrian-oriented Lower Manhattan, south of Canal Street. Our interest was for pedestrians to be able to move and for the mass transit system to be improved. You've heard about what happened under the Trade Center, and you all know it when you were there. That was a part of that, which is, you know, a very important way to move people. But on the street, we looked very hard at the question of simply banning all automobiles south of Canal Street. Came to the conclusion that that wouldn't work, that the people who, that it was very important that certain people be able to drive. It's not very democratic to say we want people who can ride in a limousine to be able to get to the office in their limousine, but the reality is that you want corporate officers who are not price sensitive to be able to get to their office by car, otherwise they're not going to put their office where you want it. And so we did a whole series of things to try to make pedestrian traffic work better. One of them was that we turned Nassau Street into a mall. As you know, it still is. It hasn't worked quite the way we expected, but it certainly took the traffic off that street. We created the Greenwich Street Special District. We put got an overpass built to connect a couple of buildings. And we worked very hard on getting a whole network of subsurface connections. Every building that was built, we tried to get to connect its basement with another one. We were going to have a connection into the Trade Center, which we raised the money for, but never, in fact, got opened. But the net of all is, besides office space then, and the seaport, was the question of residential construction. And so we wanted to see as much residential development as possible. Southbridge Towers has got about 1,600 middle-income units, and that was essentially a 50s urban renewal project type project, but it works fine. It's been a great source of housing for fundamentally municipal employees. We encouraged the transformation of obsolete office buildings into residential buildings. I think one of the most successful things the Giuliani administration did was to give a fairly significant tax breaks for that kind of transformation, and it, you know, it has worked, so that the Pace College was expanded, the hospital was expanded, so that we began to see in Lower Manhattan the kind of supporting activities that make a residential neighborhood work and make people want to live there. The numbers are quite impressive. Those of you who've read The Ungovernable City, which is a description of John Lindsay's tenure by a professor, may remember that New York was ungovernable during that period and no one wanted to be here and everybody was fleeing. Well, in addition to the 10 million square feet of publicly financed Trade Center, there was 17 million feet built in Lower Manhattan during that 67 to 73 period. My numbers are a little bit less than yours as to what the total has been since the Trade Center. But it's interesting that in the last 12 years, there's been 2.5 million square feet built in Lower Manhattan. So the competition with New Jersey, and to an extent, the fact that the Lower Manhattan is filled up, has certainly slowed that down, even though residential development is still continuing. I think what I take from all of this is that it is possible to encourage trends that are almost there, that are beginning to start. Lower Manhattan is still a major financial center. Many of us think it will become so again as it is redeveloped. It is a major source of world trade. It is an important office area. for activities that we don't even know what they are yet. The dot-com revolution created a whole lot of activity, and even though the bubble burst, a lot of those activities are continuing. Lower Manhattan is going to continue to be an extraordinary place to live and work, even though we're going to have to go through a very difficult period of rebuilding. We'll be able, I think, I hope, just to put in a little plug looking to the future, our view was that the Lower Manhattan Express, that the highway should have been depressed on the west side, that the West Side Highway should have been built. I'll just tell you one little anecdote about that. The highways are built with federal money, as you know, and the highway departments are very jealous of them. And the New York State Highway Department has never been sympathetic to joint development. But there was a brief period when the fellow who was running the State Highway Department was not really in control. And the governor, Nelson Rockefeller, agreed to have Ed Loeb negotiate on part of negotiate the West Side Highway with the city. And we developed the project, which would have been the West Side Highway, which was to depress the highway and build over it, and to build a couple of 100 acres outshore. Unfortunately, that got lost in later years, but it would have meant that West Street, instead of being the river of traffic that separates the World Financial Center and Battery Park City from the rest of downtown, could have been submerged, and you could connect them. And I think there's now an opportunity that will happen again as the Trade Center buildings are rebuilt. I don't think any of us think the Trade Center will ever be rebuilt in the form that it was, but it was an extraordinary engineering and architectural achievement. From my, not to have a negative note to end on, but from my perception, those elevators worked brilliantly, but people didn't like them. And it was, the big elevator became known as the cattle car, and it's very difficult to think about a building that's 100 stories high functioning the way the Trade Center did. But the Trade Center, as a part of the rebirth of Lower Manhattan, was undoubtedly a successful. I think some of the retail in the lower part of the building is the highest gross per square foot of any retail that those companies have anywhere in the world. And certainly as that evolved through time, that whole downtown, that whole retail section worked better, more and more efficiently. And the buildings themselves worked very efficiently. There's no question about it. And they were a part of the rebirth of Lower Manhattan, which will continue.
I'm sure the Historical Society wants me to say now that it's 8 o'clock, that fortunately we did not promise you a question and answer period, but we can provide it out with the reception that has been so generously provided to us by the Historical Society tonight. So before we absolutely conclude, I just wanted to thank Guy Tozzoli and Don Elliott, and to say that we invited them both not just to wash in nostalgia the great things we created, but also continue the contention about what works and what doesn't, and to get some history on record. And so, Guy, would you just, if you have a last word to say, would you like to reflect on Lower Manhattan and its future?
Yes. This is an idea that I've been thinking about. I think we're back in 1960, again in a strange way. We have to rebuild Lower Manhattan, but we start from a different base. And an idea that springs to mind, certainly on the Trade Center site, first thing we must think of is a fitting memorial to the people that died. On the other hand, the 16 acres probably should also be used for business purposes. The business purpose that I think is good for New York City, which is the greatest city in the whole world, is the World Trade Center. Certainly should be included in that, together with the World Financial Center. Provides jobs. An idea that springs to mind, what downtown Manhattan could use, believe it or not, is a trade mart or exhibit center dedicated to international business. Think about that for a moment. We have the Javits Center, which is mostly domestic shows. This is the greatest international city in the world. If we had trade shows scheduled, it would bring traders to this place. It would bring business people to this place. You could incorporate that into the hotel and the housing market that I think would be provided by that. And I think that's the basis for planning what could be a great attraction for Lower Manhattan. It's a great place. And I think we could make it again even greater than it was before.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you all for staying. And if you have questions, let's do them outside. Thanks.